So what I will suggest now is that we're going to be a little bit flexible on our toes now, and what we will do is we're going to shift over and welcome Dina Brewster to share her presentation. Michael, let me turn over the floor to you so you can introduce Dina. And in the meantime, Heather, let's keep in contact so we can sort out the technical issues and help you to close out the evening for us. So Michael, please take it away.
Okay, so thank you, Dina, for being flexible, and sorry, folks, about the technical difficulties. Dina Brewster is among the founders of the Eco59 project, Ecotype 59, a seed company that's been run off of her organic farm in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Sorry, I'm not sure if my video is showing there. She spent much of the last 4 years focused on growing ecotypic seed crops, seed that can provide another link in that supply chain we've been talking about for native plants in the Northeast. Today, Dina will be speaking about her farming operation, the work of Ecotype 59, and the roles that small farmers can play in fortifying regional biodiversity. She currently runs a farm called the Hickories, which is a certified organic fruit, vegetable, livestock, cut flower, and conservation seed farm down in Ridgefield, Connecticut. And she's, put the last 4 years into the Ecotype project that I think has certainly been inspiring to us as we think about how to network and how to establish all of these different players, both users and producers of seed in this region. So I'll add that Dina says she does believe in the responsibility of farmers and others to strengthen our regional agrarian economy, improve the long-range ecological stewardship of our land and water, and enliven our cultural commitment to farming. So with that, Dina, will you please share your screen and share your thoughts?
Thank you. Now, if this is, let's see, is everyone seeing this? Is that working?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. All right. First of all, thank you for that introduction. And I apologize in some ways for everybody who is logging in, hoping to see Heather McCargo and getting stuck with me. But it's my good fortune that I can ride on her coattails a little bit today. So Michael did say a fair amount about this project. I am a farmer. I run a certified organic fruit, vegetable, cut flower, livestock. We run sheep and pigs, and am new to this world of conservation seed. The land I farm here in Ridgefield, Connecticut, was the ancestral homeland of the Pagusset and the Golden Hills tribe. I want to honor the injustice of their loss and the consequent degradation of this landscape throughout our region, hopefully through our conversation today. My grandparents came to this land in 1936 after the Depression. My father stewarded it from 1960s through 2004, and then I came back, and everything began to sort of shift and change. We now have about 45 acres in production, and it's a very diversified place. I am particularly honored today that you at Native Plant Trust invited a farmer to come and to speak to your assembled group of advocates, it sounds like, and botanists and all kinds of folks. It's important to me that we begin to include farmers' voices in how we make decisions about the future stewardship of the Northeast. I came to farming pretty green. I was a public high school English teacher, and I began farming without any real experience. I started on 1 acre, and I began, and this is important, by just turning the seed packet over and doing what it said on the back. And in reviewing my introduction for today's talk, it became clear to me that not knowing exactly where I'm going, but charging ahead anyway, has been a bit of a theme for me in my career, and it will probably be clear to you at the end of today's conversation. I'm going to try to advance this if I can. Where's my advance button? There it is. So this is the map that we've all been talking about and thinking about today. It's the EcoRegional Map for the Northeast. I haven't seen it come up in anybody's slides, so I wanted to make sure we included it. It is why we farmers named this seed company Eco59. We're really focused on this region and the stewardship of this corridor. It has been said many times today, but I will say it again, that the plants from this ecoregion have the best chance of persisting in this ecoregion. Since photosynthesis and biodiversity may in fact be our only way out of this climate crisis, we are going to need a lot of healthy, persistent plants moving forward. What I love about this map is that it refocuses our minds on the concept of regionality. I think in many ways we have taken the economic, the ecological, the social immersion blender to our country in the last years. And so now Omaha from the highway looks much like Memphis, which looks much like Worcester. Big box stores have eliminated regional economies. The nursery trade means that we have hydrangea growing from Los Angeles to Providence. Native Plant Trust, who is our host today, is one stunning response to this. Garden in the Woods could not exist anywhere else. It wouldn't be the same. The Northeast, as we see in this map, is unique and special. And as such, it should look different than any other place on the planet. So after seeing this map and learning about it 4 years ago, I gave myself as thorough an education as I could from my local library, from YouTube, ordering every back issue of the Wild Seed Project's journals that I can afford, and began to really dig into the lectures of Doug Tallamy, obviously Heather's work, Stephanie Frischi, folks who are on this call, Hope Leeson, the whole lineup of people we'll be hearing from in this conference. Visited Greenbelt Native Plant Nursery, read the National Seed Strategy, and I was utterly overwhelmed. It was clear to me that we needed to return the plants from this region to this region. It was also clear that the federal government was not doing what it said it would do in the National Seed Strategy in the Northeast. And so we needed to turn all of the theories about this supply chain into practice, and we kind of needed to do that yesterday. So the Northeast has some real catch-up work to do, and it is going to get tough, and we need to get going. So with that, I only really have, as I thought about it, sort of 3 major points today, and I'm going to make them nice and easy and clear for everyone to see. I was sitting in one of Doug Tallamy's lectures years ago, and I was struck that the only photos he has of farmers are of massive dust plumes behind moldboard plows and chemical insecticides pulsing out of boom sprayers. And that ignores many, many farmers like me. I want to stand up for the farmers who are doing things differently, thinking differently, working to regenerate biodiversity on our land, eager to find more ways that farms can work to solve the climate crisis. I think, we don't get anywhere by pointing fingers, but we get ahead by building bridges and finding ways to work together. So folks in the plant conservation community on this call need to do the same with people in agriculture and vice versa. We cannot leave this work to a few massive seed companies. We cannot hope that the federal government will come in and do it for us. That leaves us. That leaves the people on this webinar. We are all we got, it seems. So apologies in advance. I actually don't know how to pronounce a lot of the Latin names of the plants we're talking about, and I am definitely a newcomer to conservation conferences like this. But I do know how to grow plants, and I know how to grow lots of them. And I am heartened in some ways, and those of you who have talked to me about this work have probably heard my shishito pepper example. I didn't know what a shishito pepper was until chefs approached me and said they'd pay $8 a pound for them. And you better believe that farmers were growing them overnight. And so when I look at the problems that we have identified in the seed supply chain and say, well, if there is a need, we must engage farmers, and particularly small to mid-scale farmers, because this problem isn't just shishito peppers, right? It's much bigger. And if we are going to turn the Queen Mary here, we need to get everyone rowing in the same direction. Young farmers, urban sliver plot growers, small scale family farmers, retirees, conservation groups. We need to get more oars in the water doing this work, growing seed, producing seed, and getting it distributed. Indigenous communities, herbalists, grazers, college students have joined in. I'm very optimistic, given the last 4 years, about the possibilities of the seed supply in the Northeast. This is a similar cycle that you saw in this morning's lecture, and it's one that the Ecotype project, which was conceived of at Connecticut NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farming Association here, during my time there, we sort of developed all this work in theory. And what I'm focusing on today really is the distance between the theory and the practice that we have traveled. We have, as is familiar to you, botanists who are wild collecting seed. We knew then we needed farmers to grow the seed. We needed seed savers. We needed nursery growers, and ultimately landscapers to return this seed back into the region. Putting that into practice meant really engaging small landholders, farmers, diversified vegetable growers. We are crucial allies in the Northeast seed supply chain. And particularly organic farmers, I think, are best or are well-suited, sustainable, regenerative, all of those words. Farmers who have their eye on a triple bottom line are best suited to this work. We have started a seed company, and it therefore must be profitable on all 3 levels of this balance sheet, just as our farms are. Economic, you see here, ecologic, and social bottom lines are very, very real for us. And as you think about growing ecotypic seed on organic farms or on small farms, not necessarily organic, you are adding a layer of diversity to the production of that farm. And farmers very quickly can see the multitude of benefits. This isn't just about the seed for us. It is also the pollination services. It is also about planting perennials and having a perennial sort of list of crops in your portfolio of crops that you grow and your business plan. And lastly, obviously with pollination services and all of the beneficial insects involved, for farmers, this means food security, and for community groups, this means food security. That is how I think we have managed to get so many farmers layered into this work. One other thing to say before I move on from this is that, in conceiving of how we can engage farmers in growing seed for the Northeast, what is the expression? You have to be the change you want to see in the world. And the change I want to see in the world, my dream, is not another humongous seed company. It is not, more chemicals in the landscape industry. The change that I am getting behind is one that involves many, many small farms growing a certain amount of seed and working collaboratively and collectively in that sort of network that Eve was talking about to produce a lot of product, a lot of seed. Organic farmers are not new to this challenge. For years, we've been working to get that word organic understood. And now we're trying to get this word ecotype understood. And I think it's a very similar, for me, disruption of first it was sort of the food system, and now it feels like a disruption of the nursery, of the billion-dollar nursery industry that is built on the elimination of regionality in this region. So that's kind of the background of why I got excited about getting farmers engaged in growing seed. And now I want to get into the reality of the last couple of years. There are a wonderful group of people to whom I owe a debt for walking me through this work. Back to that same cycle, we started with botanist Jordy Elkins at the Highstead, and he has been really shepherding the wild collection of what he verifies through the SOS protocols as genuinely ecotypic seed from this region. The next slide, or the next photo in the cycle, is these founder plots growing on my farm here in Ridgefield. Sephra, who the seed huntress who you will meet tomorrow, came and talked to us farmers about cleaning and harvesting seed. And what became clear is that we actually needed a way to get this into the commercial world. And so the seed company Eco59 has been formed, and that seed goes both to the nursery trade and to homeowners. And you'll see Connecticut NOFA has been behind a lot of the Ecotype project work in the nursery trade to return it to the landscape. A brief history of this small seed company. Eco59 is the commercial arm, and the Ecotype project has been at Connecticut NOFA, the educational arm of this work, training farmers and teaching us. So this is just a list of species that we have been collecting, or that Jordy has been able to push into this pipeline through the Highstead. In year one, we started with just 5 species and 2 farmers. We sort of thought we had a longer runway, I guess. I think we didn't realize that this stuff was going to flower and produce seed in its first year. And so we very quickly, by year 2, realized we had a lot of seed to contend with, and farmers were starting to figure out how to organize. And it was clear that we needed a seed company. So I started Eco59, which is eco59.com. Hopefully someone will put it in the chat. And that makes this plant material, the seeds that these farmers are growing, commercially available. And a seed company needs licenses, we need germination tests, we need equipment for cleaning seed, et cetera. And so Eco59 holds that license, and the farmers in the collective then send in seed. Eco59 buys that seed from the farmers, who are trained and understand some of what is expected of their growing practices. We then clean that seed, test it, package it, and sell it online, on sale today. So there are now a couple of years in, you'll see there are more seeds that have come, I guess year 3, there's an additional 5 species listed here. And then last year I sort of decided I was 2 feet in, and so we added 10 more species this year. And that means we now have 14 farmers overall involved in growing any number of these. Sometimes some of them have just 3, and some of them have up to 10 or 12 of these species in production on their land. The seed company, a few words about that. I do want to be mindful of time because I'm sure we want to get to questions, but it's a business in its infancy, and many of the crops are still unfamiliar to us, many of us who are, growing fruit and vegetables. Every year seems to be wildly different so far in our production. These are not your typical crops. And an arborist friend of mine once described how important it is in growing native plants to take what he describes as a 12-step program, meaning take 12 steps back and suddenly everything looks great. So this photo here on the left is kind of what the seed farm looks like right now at my place from a distance. And it is pretty extraordinary, and it's amazingly beautiful. And exciting to see what's happening out there. If you get in close, you get to the picture on the right, and you can see that there is a lot going on and a lot of struggles for farmers who are growing this. This picture on the right, I took of our milkweed this year, which was absolutely inundated with these darn little aphids that we couldn't seem to beat. And we squished and we did whatever. But if you notice, and I want to talk a little bit about engaging farmers in this network, if you notice these beautiful lacewing eggs at the bottom of that leaf, and so as compromised as our milkweed has been, what's powerful about bringing these crops onto farms are those little lacewings, those beneficials. And farmers see those lacewing eggs and we get dollar signs on our eyes, because those lacewings are going to protect my melons. They're going to protect my from spider mites. The list goes on and on and on. And so back to that triple bottom line, as challenging as it is for growers who are getting involved in this in a small scale way to understand the production of seed, instantly farmers can see the benefit of adding these crops to a diversified farm plan. And so in many ways, I think we have been lucky to sort of have such a forward-thinking and good group of growers. Briefly, to talk a little bit about lessons learned for those of you who are interested in engaging farmers around your local seed efforts in the Northeast. There are challenges, obviously, but there are a lot of opportunities. One of the things I hear often is from organizations trying to support a seed supply chain, and they start by trying to find land and write grants for equipment and then fund staff positions. And all the while there is a local farmer down the road struggling to stay in business and struggling to find a new market. And so I think sometimes the twinning of our efforts, finding ways to work with farmers around you, can be a really efficient way to get this initial step, this first step in our supply chain up and running. Farmers are, as you see in this slide, we are production oriented. We are fine with innovation and things changing on a dime in general. Farmers are incredibly scrappy, shovel ready, as I say here, and have a certain amount of infrastructure in place already to be able to scale this up or down pretty quickly. Though the challenges remain pretty real, which is because the yields on these crops, these seed crops, are somewhat unpredictable and remain largely unknown in the Northeast. We don't know whether or not the crops themselves will pay their own way yet. And sometimes farmers really struggle with the idea of bringing perennial weeds onto their farm. Milkweed, New York ironweed, these guys, if you don't get all that seed off, it can blow around your farm and make trouble. And so you have to have a plan for farmers to get that seed off the farm if possible, or as much of it as they want off the farm. And obviously with any new crop, there is very limited production knowledge. It can be hard sometimes when the only, back to my example at the beginning, you cannot turn the seed packet over and just do what it says on the back in growing this stuff and get a predictable yield. And so if the only resources you have are, 200-page white papers on growing milkweed, it's going to be hard to engage farmers. And so oftentimes I think a lot of the work that networks can do to create those growing protocols, hopefully Sephora can show you some of the work that CT NOFA has done around that, to help farmers understand quickly how to grow these crops, has been important. And yet, the challenges remain pretty real. The last thing I have here is marginal land equals marginal crop. So sometimes, we've had, I can't tell you how many times farmers have said, my crew saw a bunch of old plants sitting, browned out with little seed heads on the top, and they just assumed that should be mowed down. So they mowed everything down. And you have to then sort of re-educate farmers, re-educate the whole crew. And that re-education has been really exciting. I don't think we can move forward in this supply chain without farmers as an essential cog in this wheel. And so, as essential as they are, I also recognize that I'm probably not speaking today to the future farmers of America as much as I might want you to quit your day jobs and become seed farmers. I also want to iterate that this movement needs all kinds of advocates. As a small seed company and a collective of farmers is starting to grow seed at small scale for the Northeast from these ecotypes, we also need policy advocates, we need lawyers, we need marketing experts, we need business plan editors, grant writers, all of those folks. Everyone on this call, I'm sure, has something to contribute to this network as it is emerging in the Northeast. I can recall years ago saying to people in my CSA, this is probably 20 years ago when I started farming, but saying to people in my CSA, hey, you know what, go to the restaurants and ask them if they have organic vegetables from the hickories. And we sent people out to try to build this market for us. And I sort of want to do that on this call today, which is go to your nurseries or go to your local conservation groups, your land trusts around you and say, hey, are you using ecotypic seed? Do you know about the Wild Seed Project? Have you heard of Eco59? We need to make sure that the market is there to meet these farmers, all of us, as we begin to grow this seed and prioritize ecotypic seed when we are writing in conservation plans. So there are lots and lots of possibilities here, but I do think that the challenge for writing in private enterprise, commercial production into some of these public programs is very real, and it's going to be something that I hope we're able to do more successfully in the next 5 years than we've done in the last 4. For now, we really just need to sell a lot of seeds. So Eco59 is working with the Ecotype Project to try to move this seed out into the world. We have 25 species in production. We have research projects going on now connected to the business, a couple of research facilities working with us. But it's been a pretty tough road to hoe. Seed companies are not particularly easy to start or maintain. And so we need people to buy this seed and to get excited about the seed that we as farmers are producing. And it's both frustrating a little bit in the last 2 years that we have not had conservation communities buying the seed. No one has identified themselves as a buyer from Xerxes or National Fish and Wildlife or Audubon. All the folks I thought were going to line up and want the seed have not come. And so we're kind of waiting and hopefully excited about being able to serve the conservation community. But for now, I am incredibly heartened by how much support we are getting from garden club members and small scale growers and pollinator pathway enthusiasts. Some of the nursery partners are buying seed so that they can start learning how to grow seed grown ecotypes for their trade. We obviously are up against some marketing struggles. And so I include this slide only to say that the artwork for this small company has been done by the farmers in the company. And they've been incredibly supportive about trying to sort of also disrupt the aesthetic of the nursery industry that really pushes people towards the proven winners and the big supermodel plants of the nursery industry. And so they've created all of these beautiful products as well, or we've created all these products as well that will again begin to promote the beauty of wild plants. Despite that, and I hope we will hear more about this from Heather, there are some pretty major obstacles in getting people to start native plants from seed. I think in general, the feedback has been that it's been pretty challenging for folks. I talked to so many people who say, oh, well, I bought seed from Eco59 and I just threw it on my lawn and nothing happened. Or I went into the woods and threw the seed down, and I never saw anything come of it. And so I think this probably, feeds nicely into Heather's talk, but our latest push has been trying to get folks, a sort of all-in-one kit or some easy way for backyard enthusiasts as well as big conservation groups to engage with seed itself. And that certainly has been a fun challenge for me, inventing all these new products. So the last thing to speak of before questions is that I am running this seed company somewhat on purpose as a business. This collective will break even this year because it has to, because we are farmers who are doing this for our livelihoods. And we remain somewhat reliant on volunteers and the kindness of folks like you who hire me to speak and run workshops and things like that. But the cost of production, as we learn for small seeds or for small scale seed production, are very real, and we need folks to buy the seed. We need to know that that last step in the chain is really going to happen, and that the prices for small farmers and the cost of deregionalizing our seed system is very similar to what we had to spend when we tried to do the same thing to food. That local food and food without chemicals, hand grown, hand raised, it means it's going to cost more, and it's going to be a challenge to make sure that all boats rise together in this effort. And so looking forward, I have lots of plans coming down the pipeline, I hope, including one of my big dreams, which is to start working on coastal resilience. And I sort of want to close by reminding everyone that on a sustainable farm, the most important thing to sustain is the farmer. And so it's not easy to write in commercial operations and local farmers to conservation grants. But I think I want to encourage everyone to think about ways to do that moving forward together. And I am certainly hopeful that in a couple of years, I can come back to this conference and tell you about some of the other good things that are coming down the pipeline for us. But for now, I hopefully have a time for a few questions before we get started. Let me see if I can mute myself. There we are. Thanks.
Thank you, Dina. That was fabulous. And I realize there's a lot of discussion going on in the chat, so we'll just go straight to some of the questions for you. Let's see, first on the list of what I wrote down, this is really kind of a question for me. I'm wondering how you've engaged with other NOFAs in the region and how the Ecotype 59 model has been presented to them, or if there's interest in doing this in other states outside of Connecticut.
That's a great question. So it's important, and I'm sure I never do this clearly enough. NOFA is the nonprofit arm that has the Ecotype project, and they do the farmer training piece. And that started at NOFA in Connecticut, but SEFRA was really based in Connecticut, and I think there probably isn't a NOFA state that she hasn't visited at some point to do lectures and talk to staff. And that's really the farmer outreach and engagement arm. Eco 59 is the commercial enterprise. And so they are actually completely separate things. It just happened to be that I had my finger in both pies for a little while. Now it's quite clear. I'm just on the eco side. But I do think that the NOFA has, NOFA across the Northeast has a really vibrant history of starting organizations and starting businesses like this, catalyzing interest. And then allowing farmers to take this work forward. And so my hope is that the collective group of farmers, now 10 or 12 of us, in the next year, will be able to take on a lot of the peer-to-peer training that has been NOFA's job. I mean, SEFRA really, I think, launched this And my hope is the seed company will probably take some of that work forward. Folks up in Massachusetts, as you guys know, Michael, have already begun to engage with some of our work and replicate bits and pieces of this. And as you get further into Rhode Island, I think there is another great cell of people doing all of that work there as well. And my hope is that if the NOFA in your state is not engaged, it's a very easy way to engage them because they are small and scrappy and a wonderful, group of kind of get or done nonprofits across the Northeast for farmers. And they're groups that farmers trust.
Great. Thank you, Dina.
Dina, could I ask you a little bit about what guided you to choose the species that you decided to grow, and at what scale, and where do you find the challenges are in terms of knowledge of how to cultivate those and how to harvest and clean and store, and like what's the learning curve there, or perhaps on the other side of that, what kind of support could a network like the one we're trying to put together provide to help people ease into those challenges?
First off, I guess I'm fortunate in that I haven't had to make decisions about what species to put in production. Those decisions were made by Jordy at the Highstead and a bunch of other botanists with whom he is in constant contact. So the farmers really haven't pushed up into that sort of wild seed collection piece. He kind of tells us what he's found and we figure out, who has the right kind of habitat for it. I think that, I was really struck today in the distance between theory and practice, that folks at the federal level say there's $130 million available to cultivate these incredible supply chains. And here we are trying to figure out, I'm scratching my head thinking, okay, do I go dip into my retirement to possibly buy this one little piece of seed equipment that would make everything much more efficient for me? I think the models and making sure that we connect these small growers and a network of small growers and count them in to these larger grant opportunities, larger research opportunities as being a really critical piece. So I guess you asked a bunch of questions in there, but the choosing of the species is not something that farmers have done. That's really, and we look to Native Plant Trust and organizations like you guys in the future to continue to do that work, to be experts in what needs to be produced and in what order. To some extent, it's been very difficult to even find the ecotypes to make sure that we have the right permissions and all of that. That's all kind of happens above me. And in terms of the production, I think we're struggling a lot with grasses right now. Farmers really have not had a great we haven't had really high germination rates, and it's been very difficult to clean. The grasses seem challenging, and the milkweeds seem really challenging, that after a year or two getting them to persist on our land, they get really beaten back by those aphids. So I would say those have been our two biggest challenges. And then seed cleaning is really just my job with Eco 59. And that is probably for another Zoom call. It gets a little overwhelming down here, but we're making our way and slowly making what we think are appropriate investments in that.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's still much to be discussed about plot design, and I know that we internally have had lots of conversations about whether could you plant two species together, for example, for seed harvest instead of just one, and do the plots have to be linear? Can they be different shapes? And I think there's a lot of possibility, but really little guidance. And so we're still very much in an experimental phase here, I think. So I think we have a lot to learn from one another. in that regard.
I agree, and I think it's been really interesting to sort of really nice in some ways as a small farmer that when that guidance has changed, because it has felt in the last 4 years that we are making the road by walking. You know, we're saying, okay, it's the minimum number of plants to put in for a founder's plot is 200 plants. And where is it 180, or are they going to raise that to 250? And then, you know, how often do we replace those or replenish those plots with new seed? Well, it was going to be 20% every year. Now it looks like it's the whole bed every 5 years, but maybe for only some species. So as those things change, I think sometimes for, you know, the geneticists and the PhDs who are working on those protocols, it becomes very, it seems like a really big deal, but for those of us with boots on the ground, the idea of having to till under a bed and replant it next year is actually quite familiar. And so I think sometimes it's been sort of less of a big deal, that moving target with farmers, than I think a lot of the folks expect it to be. Like, we're pretty comfortable saying, well, that didn't work, let's try something else.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I think that there's, you know, each and every one of pieces of this supply chain informs other aspects of it, and you know, we still have a lot to figure out here, specifically in the Northeast, which I think is really what we're aiming for. So I think at this point maybe we'll end with the questions so that we can afford Heather some time. She's back on and ready to share her presentation. So with that, let's just all give Dina a wonderful round of applause. Thank you. That was fantastic and fabulous, as Michael said. And so without further ado, let's welcome Heather McCargo back to the floor, and take it away, Heather. Still muted, I think, Heather.
Hey, we got a screen. That's good. Okay.
All right, looks great, Heather. Take it away. You're still muted, by the way.
Okay. Thank you, Dina, for jumping in so quickly. Very discombobulating. It turned out some systems update turned all these switches off. So I really apologize. A terrible way to accept an award. But Uli and Michael gave me the job of talking about the arc of Wild Seed Project, you know, the successes and challenges. And for me, what I'm going to do is tell you why I decided to start Wild Seed Project, you know, and some of what was involved in launching a 501c3 nonprofit organization, you know, like creating a board, all the program with the seeds and the website and the publications, and then maturing a little bit more where we, you know, upped our game in fundraising and strategic planning, and then a little bit about where we're heading now. So to start with why I did that, it does have to take me back to my early years. And I was a feral child in the eastern deciduous forest of southwestern Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. And that's really where my love of the forest and nature began. Then let's see, okay, why is this not launching forward? There we go. This led me to study plant ecology in college. I attended Hampshire College in Western Massachusetts, where there were a lot of really excellent environmental science professors. And my mentor was a wildlife biologist by the name of Ray Coppinger. He was a very skilled landscape ecologist who taught just amazing and inspiring field botany and ecology classes. But his real specialty was wolves and the domestic sheep and guarding dogs and the feral village dogs from around the world. So he was really a wildlife biologist. And studying under him was really the beginning of my interest in the wild versus domesticated. And Ray spent a lot of time talking about the genetic risk of small isolated populations, as this is what was really happening with the few remaining populations of in the lower 48 states of wolves and in the upper Midwest, and then the panther, the Florida panther particularly. And there were a lot of debates and arguments about wildlife biologists as to whether some genetics from outside should be introduced to these populations to prevent inbreeding and extinction. And indeed, that did end up happening down the road because they were becoming so inbred. I also studied a lot of how landscapes change over time, you know, the ice ages, and then the past warmer climate in the millions of years leading up to the ice ages. You know, at the time, we were just beginning to hear about, you know, the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere, and it was called the greenhouse effect. But at the same time, you know, there was a little bit of a dun, 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 the ice ages were due for another ice age. So it really was in that decade of the 80s, I was in college from late 70s to early 80s, that among the environmental world, people started to hear more about the warming climate. But when I first started studying ecology, I thought the ice ages were right around the corner. I also studied, you know, one of the pillars of ecology is, you know, how plant succession after disturbance. And in New England, of course, New England had been so heavily clear-cut and agricultural and had been rebounding from the loss of agriculture in the late 1800s. And at the time, succession, there was invasive species that wasn't even really a topic. There were a few exotic plants that people were starting to notice were a problem, but old field succession, invasive species weren't a part of it back then. When I graduated, through Ray Coppinger, he introduced me to John Torrey, who was the executive director of the Harvard Forest, and he was doing alder research at Hampshire College and at the farm center, and he needed a greenhouse assistant. And so I happily took on that job with him, and he was a lovely and interesting man whose specialty was non-nitrogen fixating plants. And when I graduated, knowing my interest in trees, he said, I should really go volunteer with the propagator at the Arnold Arboretum, Jack Alexander. So I went in and met him. And for that late fall and winter, I had about 4 or 5 months where for twice a week, I went in and volunteered. And that's when I got my first deep dive of intense propagation. And Jack, you know, was growing all kind of unusual temperate woody species from seed. And he'd walk through all the different ways that you got the seed to germinate, from sometimes you'd have to put them in and out of the refrigerator or freezer, or file the heavy seed coat, or pour boiling water over them, or light a match under them. But then, you know, I remember him saying, but you know what I always do is put some of the seeds outside, and you know what? Those ones always germinate. So that really had a big impact on me. And also at the time, there was a lot of excitement and hype about new cloning techniques beyond cuttings and divisions of tissue culture. And while Jack was really fond of all the seed germination, you know, I was intrigued by that too. And the whole emphasis for it, though, was for uniformity, you know, not wanting the nursery industry, not wanting anything to be unique or different, wanting all the plants produced to be the same. And then, of course, the favoring of superior individuals. So no awareness about what that could mean genetically for the plants, even though that was a big debate in the animal biology. So I ended up deciding to not go into straight science, and I got my master's at the Conway School of Landscape Design, and that began the design phase of my life. I moved to Northern California when I finished school. I'm having trouble getting this to, yeah. And California is an amazing state, and I was smitten with the landscape and the plants there. California in the mid 80s was amidst a heavy multi-year drought, and the California Native Plant Society, which had been around for decades, was gaining a lot of visibility during that time because, of course, native plants are more suited to handling the variety of temperatures and droughts, because especially Northern California, San Francisco, you water it, you can grow plants from quite northern climates and you can grow Mediterranean climates. So I got pulled into, interest in the Native Plant Society, and I also spent a lot of time at their amazing Native Plant Botanical Garden in Berkeley, as well as the Berkeley Botanical Garden, which had a really impressive native plant collection, and the San Francisco Arboretum. And I was working in landscape architecture, but one of my bosses had been at Kew Gardens in England and had been the curator of the native plant collection at the Berkeley Botanical Garden, which was what really got my interest in public horticulture. And so 5 years later, my husband and I moved back east, and in the winter of 1990, I became the assistant propagator at Garden in the Woods to Bill Brumbach, who was the propagator at the time. And a year and a half later, Bill was in the process of just launching the Native Plant Trust plant conservation work with rare plants. And so I was able to get the position as head propagator. And I inherited Bill's very skilled nursery volunteers and also the decades of propagation experience and gardening experience with native plants. What I brought to it was my ecology background, and also I had very extensive organic growing skills. And I think this is a really important piece that I brought to the Garden in the Woods, and particularly to the nursery work, as growing healthy plants isn't just a matter of not using pesticides. You've got to have, a live soil, to have all those mycorrhizal fungal connections and all the healthy soil microbiome. You've got to have potting soil that's not sterile. And one of the first things I did was make my own compost-based potting soil. I ended up writing a nice article for it in Horticulture magazine, and was able to ship the practices right away and really enjoyed that. So about 5 years later, in the summer of '95, I moved to Maine and laid low for a while with a couple cute little children. But one of the things I really found amazing in Maine was how different it was from Southern New England. It's New England's largest state. It has a small population, just not even 1.5 million people. And there's very much an independent frontier attitude with the people that's just so different from Southern New England. Now, Maine has had for decades a very sophisticated organic food and agriculture movement, but is really lacking in the awareness of the importance of native plants and ecological landscaping. Now, I've wrestled with why was this the case in Maine? And I think some of it's because it's a rural state with seemingly a lot of wild land. And Portland and Southern Maine has gotten very urban, suburban, but in general, people still feel like there's plenty of nature. but it's not. And, we've all heard the numbers of the, huge decline in wildlife in the last 50 years. And I'm 62 years old. I have witnessed this retreat of so many common native plants over my lifetime. And Maine has this problem as much as the rest of the world. So since I had focused my whole life's work on propagating native species, I felt like this was really the missing link to the growing movement to plant native plants. And so I saw a need, and I had an idea to create a grassroots movement to propagate the plants so that a wide range of people could participate in increasing native plant populations. And Maine seemed like the perfect place to launch this because of its, because of its sort of slow food, slow lifestyle movement, a lot of do-it-yourselfers in Maine, and then so many small farms looking to diversify, and a lot of experienced growers. Now, a decade ago, right before I launched Wild Seed Project, the environmental movement in Maine was starting to spread the message about planting native plants and pollinator gardens. Yet there was a real lack of experience on how to grow them, and even less awareness about the trends in the nursery trade, the modern nursery trade, which are really favoring clone plants and an intensive use of pesticide and chemical fertilizers. Also, there was nowhere to buy the native seeds. So I felt like I knew how to do this. And I was also, one last thing that inspired me was Jimmy Carter. He did his best work, I think, in launching Habitat for Humanity in his mid-50s. And I was 55 when I started Wild Seed Project. So I always used him as a sort of, if he can do it, I can do it too. So the early years of Wild Seed Project involved a couple of things. First was building the organization, getting board members who would help me pull this off, then needing a lot of volunteers, and then ultimately staff to make it all happen, and then developing the program of seeds. Now, I knew nothing about starting a nonprofit organization. I had worked at small ones and big ones like Native Plant Trust. And what I loved about nonprofits is that the work is mission driven versus for-profit division. And I wanted Wild Seed Project to be a movement, not just a business. And I knew that the work of collecting, cleaning, harvesting, handling all the seeds, and then motivating a lot of people was going to take a lot of volunteers. And so I wanted to set it up as a nonprofit organization. So since I didn't know how to do this, but I'd gotten some great advice from another founder who said, find really good board members. This is really critical for success. So that very first year, I pulled together a handful of people as my founding board members with a variety of skills. Some had organizational development skill, we had a lawyer, editing, and then ecological science and education. So I had a wide range of skills in those early board members. We were a working board in those first couple of years, especially, and we just were able to hire one part-time staff person, Catherine Dillon. Now, she was unusually energetic and skilled, bringing a lot of experience with nonprofits, finance, and then she was incredibly creative with design issues. We were mostly a group of middle-aged women. We had one man. We all, with a variety of professional skills, well on in our careers, but we had a lot of passion and drive to make this happen. And we also thought about, what if we were in our 20s and 30s right now? What would, how would we feel with what's happening in the world? And so we felt highly motivated to do this. Over the 8 years of Wild Seed Project, we've had about 20 board members. All have been key to contributing to our success, but a handful of them have really done much of the heavy lifting, and I'm really grateful to them. Now, that very first thing we did was have to file for nonprofit status. And we also worked on branding, you know, coming up, and that was Catherine Dillon and myself. We worked on coming up with the logo and branding. We then right away also started building an email and mailing list, and membership and donors started working on that right away. Fortunately, in Maine has a great organization called the Maine Associations of Nonprofits, and they were a huge resource for us in helping us figure out how to build the organization. You know, they had all kind of resources on how to start a 501c3 nonprofit, how to fundraise, how to engage donors, and also critically, I've found out succession planning, how to mature an organization beyond the founder. So while we were doing that, in the meantime, it was summer, and I began seed collecting for the first 35 species that we managed to get on the website that year. And like I said, the seed piece of it, this was easy for me. I knew how to do this. I knew that I wanted to focus on common species, not rare plants. And I wanted a lot of species that I knew beginning propagators would be successful with, not the more tricky, slow growing species that take more experience. Initially, I collected some of the seeds, as many species as I could from the wild. I knew a lot of people who owned land in Maine. And so there were places where it was easy to get the people's permission and get the seeds. And then other species that either didn't grow wild in Maine, or that were rare, like blue lobelia. I had those both in my wild type native garden, and had a bunch of other friends with the same. So about 2/3 of our species are all known wild provenance. And we were able to get 35 species up on the website that first year. And so the other critical piece was showing people how to sow the seed, because like Dina said earlier, people don't know how to do this, you know, including a lot of nurseries. Nurseries don't tend to be seed propagators anymore. And so we spent a lot of time developing information that would be easy for people to understand. And the first really critical message to get across was that fall and winter are the ideal time to sow the native seeds, because so many of our species need a winter cold period outside to germinate. Also getting people to sow the seeds in pots, not just toss them out in the landscape. There's just so many, any patch of soil, there's so many weed seeds in there, and most of the native species grow much more slowly. So you're much more successful when you grow them in pots. And so I'm just going to show you here's a little graph we picked to sort of show the pots, the ingredients you need, the organic potting soil, sand, label, and then wire mesh to cover them, putting them outside. And so here I'm going to sort of walk you through the process. Really critical to use good compost-based potting soil. And you can sow the seeds very thickly. This is one way that native seeds are quite different from our vegetable and annual crops and other domesticated plants. They grow more slowly, and they seem to germinate really well close together. And so in one little 4-inch pot, you can easily have 50, sometimes 100 seeds. And so after you sow the seeds, you need to cover them with coarse sand, and then you carry them outside. And you cover them with wire mesh, and you also put them in the shade. That's critical so that when spring comes, you don't have these huge swings of temperature and moisture before the seeds germinate. And then you just let the winter happen. And so freeze and thaw, rain, ice, snow, all of our native seeds, they have a much heavier seed coat than domesticated seeds, and they really need that freeze and thaw to help break the heavy seed coat, and then you get really nice germination in the spring. So this picture is taken in probably the first or second week in May. Here you can see, in these 4-inch pots, you can have hundreds of seedlings of each species in the pot. So 1 square foot with 9 4-inch pots, and you can be growing hundreds of plants. Now, if you were doing this indoors in a greenhouse, you could never have the seedlings that close together. You'd have fungal gnats and damping off and mildew, but outside, with the rain and snow, the seedlings are healthy and strong. They germinate when the temperatures are right for each condition, species, and that can be early, when it's still frosty, even in March when it still regularly goes below freezing. Many species will start to germinate, and then other species wait till the heat of the summer. This is a really easy way to produce a lot of plants. Then what I like to have people do, this is Jack in the Pulpit seedlings. That's one of the last species to germinate. They wait till the real heat of early summer to come up. Then what I like to have people do with those little pots of seedlings is not plant them right out in the landscape. They will not be able to compete in June, July, and August with all the weeds and other mature plants growing. So I have people take that little pot, tip it out, and put it in a much bigger pot to grow on for the summer. This is silky dogwood. This 8-inch pot has 50 seedlings in it. And so that can be grown on in the summer, again, by just tipping the whole pot out and putting it in a much bigger pot. If you're a nursery, you can, over the summer, divide up and pot them up individually or as clumps. But for homeowners and community groups, if you keep all the seedlings together and just move the pot size up, it's much more low maintenance, and you also don't disturb the roots at all. So you have much quicker, faster growth. And then what I like to have people do, like these silky dogwoods, they'll be 18 inches tall by the end of the summer. And then in September, hopefully you've prepared the site where your silky dogwood hedge is going to go, and you can just divide these up and plant them then. Now, not all native plants cooperate the way people like. This is wild geranium, and some years in the spring, only 1/3 will germinate. So when you look in this pot, the bigger leaf, that's one that germinated a couple that germinated the year before, but the rest germinated the second year. And this staging the germination over even a couple years is a good strategy for a wild plant. And it's one of the things that's nice about outdoor propagation is you're not getting these out of sync with our climate. And what I like to have people do in a situation like this is you can pot up the ones that germinated the first year and then just save that little pot, and the rest will germinate the second year. Some species are really slow growing. This is partridge berry, 2-year-old partridge berry seedlings. So this is where I just knew all this propagation information like the back of my hand. So getting this figured out was very easy for me. And then, of course, there are some native species. These are ones that give them a bad reputation for being difficult to grow, like the trout lily and the wood anemone, that have seeds that are hydrophilic, which means they can't dry out. You've got to sow them as soon as they ripen, and they will often take 2 years to germinate. And something like trout lily can take a dozen years before you'll even get a flowering plant. Now, also doing this work takes a lot of hands, and that was another reason I wanted to do it as a nonprofit. I felt like this work needs lots of people, and nonprofits are great at engaging volunteers. And I've built over the years a great team of seed volunteers, some who I've both trained them all. I do have one that's a retired plant ecologist, so a wide range of people, skilled master gardeners, but training them in the protocols of seed collecting and then handling the seed. And the seeds are beautiful. Everybody likes working with the seeds. These are these are Canada lily, wild lupin, wild geranium, and cleaning the seeds. You know, this is a lot of work, but it is really fun work. And I have people begging to help with the seed cleaning and sorting and packaging. And so this has been a really critical piece of the building of the organization, getting lots of people learning how to do this, and they have a great time. Like, people want to do this. It's joyful work. We actually call it seed therapy. So then that's the seeds, and we were able to get 35 species up the first year. Now we have about 90 species on the website every year. Creating the other pillar was we had to raise the educational level. We had to, you know, teach people in Maine about why native plants matter and how to grow the seeds. So building the website, we knew it needed to be beautiful. We, at the time, you know, when 8 years ago, it was a lot of work finding a web designer. You know, I wrote all the text for it. Catherine Dillon helped figure out the creative part. We had another volunteer, Lisa Look, who was a photographer, and she both organized all my slides that I had so that we could use them on the website. And then she also ended up taking a lot of pictures for us. Later, we were able to get a grant to pay her to help develop our photo library. And then the website was nice because that was all a free online resource. And the other piece that I really had wanted to do was to have a print publication. And I, from my life in Down East Maine, I knew John Wilson, who founded Wooden Boat Magazine and the Wooden Boat School. And he founded that maybe in 1970. And when he was first doing the magazine, he said everybody told him it was crazy, wooden boats, nobody cared about them anymore. And instead, it ended up building a community. And it's a huge organization that does amazing things. And so I really held that to heart, that I wanted to have a print publication that would both educate people, have something they could hold in their hand, and inspire people. I got my old mentor, Roger Swain, who was the science editor of Horticulture magazine, to agree to be our editorial advisor. And that's how I was able, you know, the first year particularly, I had nothing to show. You know, I went to some people I knew, Bill Kalina, Don Hudson, Frank Drummond, people, and said, you know, I'm starting this print publication, will you write for it? And having Roger, saying Roger was going to help, really helped pull it off the ground. The first 3 volumes, that was all done with a couple key board members and myself, and, you know, our paid Catherine Dillon part-time. She was incredibly creative. The first 2, she did all the design and layout. The third year, Wild Seed 3, the one with the road in it, we were able to hire a graphic designer to help, who did the rest. And then it was always a big challenge, not coming up with the ideas and creating the magazine, but raising the money for it. And I really I have had some amazing donors step forward and say, how can I help? And I got a bunch of them to help underwrite with some of the expenses of the magazine. For the second 3 issues, we were able to hire a professional editor, Marina Schaffler, who we've been working with ever since. And in the first, so these 6 volumes, you know, there were some challenges to creating a periodical as far as where you could sell it, because bookstores don't always want periodicals. So there was a lot of challenges with it, which is why we have pivoted, and I'll show you what we're doing now. But these magazines really were all the whys and hows of growing native plants and seeds. And I got a bunch of people who are probably listening to this talk now wrote great articles for us, and I'm very proud of them. The other thing that we had some early success with was some grant writing. Again, we had a couple skilled board members with grant writing experience. In the fall of 2015, the Maine DOT awarded us a grant to create a manual to help them restore native plants on the roadside. And this is now available for free online through our website. You can download the whole thing. And this is one of the places that a lot of the propagation information is, on native seed sowing and storage and collecting times is in that publication that anyone can take a look at. This has also been one of the challenges. Probably the biggest message in this whole publication was to not be mowing during the growing season unless you're just mowing invasives, and change has been slow with the DOT. They're still mowing in July, August, and September, and even early October, which is well before many of the native species ripen. We also were the recipient in the, couple years into Wild Seed Project of some Patagonia grants, and that was a great boost for us both because Patagonia provided a lot of free resources to its grantees, professional resources where you could use them to, do work for you, from conducting surveys to graphic, pretty much anything. It was pretty amazing. And one of the years we got the money to hire a seed fellow. This is Tracy Weber. She was with us for a year, working alongside me, helping with the seeds and learning how to do it. And now she has a native nursery called Blue Aster Seeds up in the Augusta area. But raising, money to match the growth we kept having year after year, we slowly were getting more sophisticated. We were attending more Maine Association and nonprofit training sessions. But, the board finally realized we really needed to up the game, which means we needed to create a strategic plan and we needed to engage a professional fundraiser to really train the board and staff and guide our strategy. And this was a critical turning point for us. It's easy to be, fundraising consulting is expensive. We used Alyssa Wright down in Southern Maine, but it paid for itself in droves and really was a big boost for us. Our membership has continued to grow every year, and we have a really amazing member and donor base that I'm particularly proud of. The people who have joined in with Wild Seed Project are a really spectacular group of people. And I would like to call out that a lot of our momentum, especially in donors, has come from older women. And now that I'm an older woman, kind of a neglected part of society, and I'm telling you, there were a few people who came up to me and said, Heather, how can I help your organization? And that really was critical for helping move us forward. Now, it took several years for the board and our staff, some of the key staff, we were working for several years on strategic planning and financial planning. And in the winter of 2020, Erin Clancy, who had recently come on the board, she became board chair, and she really helped us bring the strategic plan to the finish line with our 10-year impact plan. And one of the things you learn when you're, working with donors and grant writers is they want to see, clear impact plan of what you're planning to do over the next decade, and also clear mission and vision. And so we retitled it Rewilding the Maine Landscape, because, we had been really impacted by Doug Tallamy's research, on when a landscape, when the biomass of native species is below 70%, there's just not, the food web falls apart, and you don't have the insects and birds, which are really the bellwether of ecosystem health. And so we called it the Rewilding Maine Landscapes. And you can view this online, and it's a great read. And we had, outlined where we wanted to be in the next 10 years, especially expanding access to native seeds, broadening our outreach, leveraging more partnerships with other organizations, and then measuring success. And a key part of that was our launching this pledge to rewild as a way of sort of measuring success and motivating a lot of people. And when Anna Fialkoff, who I stole from Garden in the Woods, came on, this became a big part of her first work with us that summer of 2021. And the other thing summer 2020, sorry, Anna, but that 10-year impact plan, that came out right as COVID hit. And also when COVID hit, our seed sales, which had been going up radically every year, people were even more desperate to get native seeds. And so we were scrambling to keep up. And we had launched this impact plan, and then we needed to have a way of measuring success. So the Rewilding Pledge, one of our board members, Julia Frederick, who's a landscape architect, she herself and some of her friends created these cool before and after images of showing typical landscapes and how we wanted people to envision them. And, we were really aiming to get people planting their landscapes densely. The other thing we were doing was pivoting from Wild Seed, the magazine, to these topic specific guides, and we wanted them to align with the Rewilding Pledge. So the first one we did was on native trees, and again, that was the first year Anna was with us, and she and I worked on this together. And now creating the guides is Anna's takes the lead on that. And these have been much easier to get out in the world because they're more book-like and single topic. So that's been really fun. And then with our rapid growth and all the strategic planning and successional planning that we had done was with our growth of our organization, it was time to hire a full-time executive director and more staff. So when COVID hit, we were a staff of 4. That fall, the board of directors had been doing the fundraising and committed to hiring a full-time person to be the executive director the next spring. And this is Andrea Berry. You'll get to meet her tomorrow. And there are now 9 great people working at Wild Seed Project. So huge growth. And, Andrea brings a lot of organizational skills, and you'll get to hear more from her tomorrow, but she knows she's much more skilled than me in leveraging partnerships and working with groups that we hadn't reached. We've been very successful in reaching not just the converted, we've converted a lot of people, but now we wanted to reach much more different audiences. Particularly, we've always shared, the seed sales and publications, they are a revenue stream for us, but we give away a lot of free seeds and information and plants. And that's a critical piece of our work as a nonprofit organization, is reaching out to those people who wouldn't be able to do it on their own. So Andrea's led the way. So, where are we going next? One of the other things we've been working on the last years, we've partnered with the Cape Elizabeth Land Trust, and because we have not had a home that wasn't my backyard to have all our propagation operation, and we are now setting up our native seed center in Cape Elizabeth on this land trust property. And we're very excited about it. It will be all the outdoor seed sowing methods, for people to be able to see. We'll have, the goal is to have founders plots of every species we sell, and to have, known, the known provenance of all those seeds. And then the other thing, people, then also providing an alternative to the kind of plants that are usually produced by nurseries, which is cloned and all these sort of new horticultural mutants, and also having organic nursery practices. I see that as a really critical piece for the native seed movement, because there are a lot of nasty chemicals used in the nursery industry, not just the pesticides, but the petroleum-based fertilizers. That for obvious reasons is a problem. Osmocote is still widely used in the nursery trade, and not only is that a petroleum-based fertilizer, but it's coated in plastic. We got to change from these practices. In Maine, there's still a big problem where there are a lot of poached, wild collected plants sold in the nursery trade, sometimes nicely packaged, other sides just potted up. This is still a big problem in Maine. So we will offer the straight species. Now, the other thing that, we want to have more seed to offer. And there's a huge demand for bulk seed. But what people don't realize is how much seed it takes to produce pounds of native seeds to then go broadcast in the landscape. And when you broadcast those seeds in the landscape, remember, success is when like 1% of those seeds germinate. So this is coastal Joe Pye weed. And these are probably hundreds of thousands of seeds in this big bowl here. That doesn't even weigh 1 pound. And so to me, I am much more interested in seeing these wild, genetic seeds being sown. Then you can have almost all the seed germinate and become plants. This is blue-eyed grass. These are 500 seeds of blue-eyed grass. Look how, and this is blown up big. Just sent these seeds to Alexis at Nasami to propagate. You take those 500 seeds and sow them on a restoration process. You'll be lucky if 1 or 2 of them land where they're going to germinate and grow. I would really like to see a lot more people sowing the native seeds. So just in conclusion, what have I really seen change since I founded Wild Seed Project? Well, the public awareness about, they're hearing the word native plant and about climate change is finally there. That has been decades in coming. But to me, that's really exciting that finally people, the general public has woken up that we have a big problem on our hands and we've got to do something. Less awareness is still there on the loss of biodiversity, which equals nature, and its role in the climate crisis. So that's still a big job we all have to do. But the other thing that having lived out west, where New England's conservative, but out west, the restoration movement for more than a decade has already been looking at how ecoregions have shifted, climate change is here. And I have witnessed that in just the 25 years I've been in Maine. How it feels like Massachusetts now, and we're going to be Virginia in another decade. So, I would really like to see this Northeast Native Seed Network recognize that not only are the ecoregions shifting, but this is nothing new. Our flora, all plants and animals, populations contract and migrate over time, not from continent to continent, but within a region. And focusing on just the historic range of plants is a very narrow view of how plant communities evolve over time. It's even kind of a Eurocentric view. It's just we're taking that point in time. I mean, I know 500 years ago is when Europeans came and caused a lot of disturbance here, but still, and now we're talking about shifts in a decade, you know, in the next few decades, big shifts, not centuries like the messaging was even, you know, 20 years ago, you know, now. So, you know, what makes me hopeful is seeds, the seeds that all of our great native plants produce. You know, they have evolved to have to be genetically diverse and to hopefully land, you know, that plant is sending them out in the world. So, you know, so that they can handle the shifting climate. They've done it in the past, and I do think a lot of our species will be able to do it if we give them the space to do it. So there, I've given you a huge mouthful, I'm sorry. And I hope you have some questions, because I had to gloss over a lot to not go on forever.
That was really fantastic, Heather. Thank you very, very much. We do have a few questions, and there's lots of congratulations that are coming in the chat as well. A couple questions about the specifics of your compost-based seed mix and whether it contains peat at all, if that's something you're willing to share.
Yes.
Look, an easy one.
So when I was at Garden in the Woods, you can find the old horticulture article. I don't know if it's online though, but that was when the first big commercial composting operations were happening. And, you know, I got a tractor trailer load delivered to Garden in the Woods, and they ended up using some in the garden too at the time, but it was all sifted to 1/4 of an inch. And I used compost, aged bark mulch, sand. I did use vermiculite and perlite. If I was growing acid-loving bog plants, then I would use, you know, peat. But no, the whole point was to not use peat moss. That was you know, both to have potting soil that had live compost in it and to get away from peat moss, because I did not see it as sustainable to be mining peat moss. You know, probably harvesting this live sphagnum on the top. You could treat some bog areas as sort of hay fields and do that, because that grows back slowly, but it grows back. But in fact, it took, after I wrote the article when I was still at Garden in the Woods, but it took a couple years for Roger Swain to get it through the board there, because they were so afraid of the peat industry pushback, which did happen, and I got a lot of letters from them. But no, I tried not to. You know, at Wild Seed Project now, we are right now, you know, because we haven't set up our native seed center, we're not making our own potting soil. Now there are a lot of commercial brands available. And we've been using, there's one called Living Acres and there's one called Coast of Maine. What I do encourage people not to do is get the sterile, like Fafford has a sterile potting mix that's inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi. And you know, we are just scratching the surface on what we know about the mycorrhizal fungi. And what we do know is that there's thousands of different species, and the ones that they can mass produce in a laboratory and market as a product, you know, there's a huge chance we're going to introduce, it'll be from somewhere else, and it will end up wiping out our local mycorrhizal fungi. So to me, the best thing is having aged bark mulch, and leaf mold is really nice in the potting mix, but that obviously takes to do. And then now with the jumping worms, that's a new problem that I don't have an answer to. But right now, that's
coming up in the chat now too, that the concern about jumping worms being moved around in composts and bark mulches and
so the native seeds, that to grow the plants, they need very little even compost. you know, they really don't. They're not they don't need the nutrients of our agricultural and domesticated plants. So it's not a lot of compost that you need. And that's the other beauty of planting out juveniles. You know, they've only been growing for, you know, 6 months, and then they get planted out in the fall. And, you know, you can have gravel underneath them or some set up or up on benches, so you're not going to get the jumping worms in them. But I don't have all the answers to the jumping worms. Obviously, that's a huge, I mean, to me, that should be motivating more people to not buy so many products. And what can you do on your own land? Grow your own mulch, you know, save your leaves.
Yeah, it's a nobody has the answers to that one quite yet. Just a few other questions for you. Wondering if you know of any other kinds of production nurseries that are stratifying seeds outdoors in the way that you've outlined. And is that an approach that, or do most folks, because they have greenhouses, are doing it on indoors on heat mats and trying to accelerate the process?
Yeah. Well, the problem with that is it takes extra energy, for one. You know, why put your seeds in the refrigerator when you can do it outside, and they don't get out of sync. And in fact, the freeze and thaw works better than the 40-degree temperature of the greenhouse. So, you know, when I was at Garden in the Woods, when the nursery was there, it was all done outside. We didn't, you know, that's where, you know, I copied this, you know, that's where I first learned this system from. Yeah, I don't know I know lots of individuals who've done this. Like I said, it's also, you know, why use all that extra energy and then you get the things out of sync? Now, there are some species, ferns really benefit. You know, you can grow, the fern spores take a really long time to grow, and they need, you know, warm weather to germinate and grow. So you can do that indoors over the winter.
Well, I think of it too as just as another sign of how we're trying to manipulate the process to speed it up, to churn more plants out faster, rather than being patient with and working on their time scales. So
I could see a nursery, you might do a little bit of both. Like you could have a few species that you get a head start with, you know, like lobelia. It's like you could germinate, you could have the seed flat outside for the winter, then bring it in March and, you know, it could be in a cool greenhouse and it would germinate and grow a little quicker, and then you might have some stuff earlier. But you're playing a big sync game, and, you know, we do have to use less energy, you know. And so I think it's totally, the thing that makes it more challenging is everybody wants plants early in the spring to plant. And that was a big part of our messaging. In fact, why we started the fall native plant sale, getting people thinking of planting these young plants in the fall. So I'm not saying never say never to greenhouses, but they use a lot of energy. They're also a lot of fun. I love greenhouses.
Michael?
I have to say, it really resonated with me to hear you talk about seed therapy in the process of cleaning seeds. I found some people don't love that therapeutic process as much as I might. But in the same way, I've definitely been inspired by you under the big tent at Common Ground, basically laying down the short version of a lot of what you talked about today for seed starting protocols and otherwise. I'm wondering, because it seems like a lot of folks are asking, how did you get involved with DOT in Maine? How did that come to be, and what was the process for writing that guide like? How did you approach it?
I went to at Connecticut, at Yukon. There was a DOT conference that Yukon put on, and I went. It was in September in 2015. I went, and when I was there, there was a lot of people from Rhode Island, and one of the people from Rhode Island actually was talking about how they had been looking at plots on the side of the road that hadn't been mowed, and you know, even though nothing had been planted there were surprisingly few surviving native plants. And I met Bob Mooseman, who was the vegetation manager at the Maine DOT, and he you know, we changed cars, and then the next, when I got home, he sent me an email and said, I'm really interested in what you're doing. Can you come meet me at the Kennebunk Plains? I forget what, I think he lived down there. And can we walk around and talk some more? And when I went there and talked to him for a while, and you could tell I knew what I was talking about, seeds. And he said, well, you know, we're about to give out a big grant. Most of the money is going to go to the Maine Natural Areas Program to set the roadside for pollinators and native plants. But I think you should apply for a grant, and I want you to write a book on how to restore the roadside native. So, you know, first it was only fill out 1 page of paperwork. It ended up being, lots of pages of paperwork and a lot of processing, but we got the grant and we had 2 years to do it. So probably the hardest thing was more getting all the pictures together. Getting pictures together is a ton of work. And I didn't show the cover, but we had to Photoshop the front and back cover to show the tractor mowing in the winter, not in the summer, which is when we took the picture, because we couldn't get it of them not mowing at the right time of year. But they really he gave me complete freedom to write what I wanted to write. We had a couple of the botanists from Maine Natural Areas Program reviewed all the documents. And same with Kate McDonough at Nasami. She was my, propagation person who reviewed all the documents. And I remember her saying, pointing out there were a few species that she had trouble germinating. And I said, I think it's because even a cold greenhouse isn't as cold as the real outdoors for stratifying the seed. But it was, what's been disappointing is change is slow to happen. Bob's retired, and they're still mowing in the growing season.
Yeah, I can see that slow change as well, and it's still slow to this day. I do think to what a lot of people are saying in the chat, and I think to a lot of the points you brought up, Heather, we're not trying to solve this overnight, nor do we expect to have solutions to all of the different ecological challenges that are on the ancillary to seed production. But I do think we have a clear mosaic of different people in different locations throughout these ecoregions of New England that have different ways of approaching this. But I hope we can come together and learn something. And I've learned an awful lot from you. So a great deal of gratitude goes to the work you've been doing. Just more of a compliment than a question, I guess.
Oh.
Yeah, I wanted to echo that as well, that you've been a real inspiration for a lot of folks and continue to be so. Thank you, Heather.
Well, thank you for getting the ball rolling on weaving people together, because that obviously is what needs to happen to go forward. And I think we do need more public push on getting some of these things to happen. So I in the DOT manual, I had a line about, I wasn't trying to get so that people couldn't use their mowing machines. Instead, they could spend all summer mowing the invasive species, which is a huge thing to tackle too. And if they weren't mowing, everything, we would have that chance to tackle the invasives.
Well, let me just say thank you again, Heather, for a wonderful presentation. And just want to be respectful of everybody's time here today. And thank you everyone for joining us on the first day of what looks like it's been a very successful launch so far. We've had wonderful speakers. Thank you to Dr. Patricia DeAngelis, to Eve Allen, to Heather, and to Dina Brewster for sharing some of their passion and experiences today. Thank you to all the participants and your engagement in the chat and enthusiasm, and particularly for the sort of sharing of links and information. I think that's really one of the really wonderful things about this platform, although I do miss in-person events. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all again tomorrow at 10 a.m. sharp. And we're going to be diving much deeper into some of the aspects of the supply chain, and looking forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. So With that, we will bid you a good afternoon and looking forward to saying good morning tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.